Everyone. We're going to give just a couple extra minutes here in case people are having problems connecting, and then I'll get started. Just checking the chat. Oh, good morning. Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I'm talking to Backyard Astronomy Guy. That's his handle in the chat. These are my notes, just so I make sure I don't forget anything. And then I have the chat slides. You might see me using these during the presentation. All right. One more minute. Let's see. Okay. Aloha. I'm not going to try to pronounce that, sorry. P-A-G-E-E-L-S-E. Okay, let's see. Yeah, let's get started. So, oops, get the slides set up. There we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer German. I'm a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, usually to Michigan, but now I'm coming to you from online. And we are here today to talk about planetary protection. How do we keep planets and other bodies in our solar system free from contamination? Before I get into this, I just want to speak a moment about answering your questions. So I can't see you, I'm talking to you, but you can't talk back to me. So what I'm going to try for the first time in this presentation is if you have any questions while I'm presenting, please type them in the chat box or comments, whichever it's named for you, and I will pause between sections of the presentation to check the chat box and answer any questions you have. So that's how that's going to work, and I'm going to check right now. Right. So it's going to look like that. Okay, let's get into this. Planetary protection. What does that mean? So, planetary protection is the practice of protecting solar system bodies from contamination by Earth life, not just humans, but all life on Earth, microbes, viruses, bacteria, etc. And it also means protecting Earth from possible contamination from other life forms that may be returned back to Earth with samples from missions. The point here is to protect the science, it is to protect the environments we're exploring, and of course to protect ourselves, Earth. So, NASA and other international space agencies all have a common agreement on protecting the solar system from ourselves. NASA assigns every mission a protection category, and we're going to take each one at a time here. So, what is a category 1? Their categories range from 1 to 4. Well, and then there's a 5th later we'll get to also. So, category 1 are things that do not have processes to help understand the creation of life, and basically that means scientists are not concerned about contaminating them. That's about it. So right now there's 3 worlds and types of worlds that are assigned into category 1. Mercury, the planet closest to the sun. Io, which is a moon of Jupiter. You can see right there on your screen the yellow. And undifferentiated metamorphosed asteroids, which is really just a fancy term to mean asteroids that aren't interesting. Okay. Category 2 is kind of the catch-all category. It's pretty much everything that's not a 1, a 3, or a 4. But officially, category 2 are places that scientists know have processes that help create life, but scientists are not worried about contaminating them. Either there just aren't enough processes, or they're just too remote from the path we know that life took. So there are a lot of things in this category. There's Venus, there's our moon, most comets, many asteroids, Jupiter and its moons except for 3, they have their own categorizations. Saturn and all of its moons except 2, which have its own categorizations. Uranus and all of its moons are category 2. Neptune and all of its moons except 1, which has its own categorization, are category 2. And most of the objects in the Kuiper Belt. And just a reminder, the Kuiper Belt is our solar system's second asteroid belt outside the orbit of Neptune. That's where the dwarf planets Pluto, Eris, Haumea, and Makemake live. And there's probably a lot more out there that just haven't been discovered or officially recognized yet. All right, category 2, big bucket. So, what is a category 2 star? This is pretty much the same as category 2, except NASA realized at some point after they had 1, 2, 3, and 4 that there's a little bit of a difference here that's important, and they wanted to call it out and note it. So there's has a little bit more requirements. But basically, the difference between a category 2 and a category 2 star is water ice. So water, we know, is necessary for life, as we know it anyway, to come about. So any place that has liquid water or ice water is automatically more important in our search for life than those without, and hence category 2 star. There are only 4 worlds currently in this category that we know of. There may be more assigned later. But so there is Ganymede, moon of Jupiter, should be here in the top left. And back beyond that on the top is Triton, moon of Neptune. Down here on the bottom left is Titan, which is a moon of Saturn. And then far bottom over there, Pluto and its moon Charon. Okay. Now, category 3 is where things get serious. These are objects that have life-creating processes, and scientists are worried about contaminating them. So, right now, we only have 3 worlds assigned to this category. Mars, our neighbor planet, Europa, which is one of the moons of Jupiter, and Enceladus, which is one of the moons of Saturn. And the only difference between a category 3 and a category 4 is whether or not the mission comes in contact with the world's atmosphere or surface. So category 3, you have spacecraft that do flybys or can go into orbit but not touch the atmosphere. In category 4, you have landers, rovers, probes, anything that's entering an atmosphere or landing on a surface. And talking about category 4, Mars is special. Because right now we are highly intent on search for life on Mars, there's a lot of indication there of processes and the elements needed for life as we know it to come about. We just want to make sure, again, we're protecting that environment and we're protecting our own science and our own investigations. So Mars has 3 subcategories for itself under category 4, A, B, and C. 4A is for landers and probes that are not looking for life. There's not as much restriction. There's still plenty of restriction, but not as much as 4B, which is landers and probes that are looking for life. We need to make sure that we're not contaminating the findings we get with life from Earth. And then 4C are any missions, doesn't matter what kind or what their purpose is, any missions to what's called Martian special regions. And on the map there, you should be able to see, well, actually, it might be a little light, but North and South poles are both considered special regions because that's where the ice and the water is. There's also irregular boundaries because different places on Mars potentially have water closer to the surface or other processes that we feel are important. All these special regions, very, very stringent requirements. That means you have to follow a lot of rules on what can and can't be done. And in some cases, we just don't even send missions because we don't have the technology yet to be clean enough or to do the correct kind of analysis without interfering. Let's see. Let's check for some questions. We've pretty much gone through all the categorizations of planetary protection now. So let's see if anybody has anything. So yes, the feedback echoing. I do know about that. I apologize. I actually did try to use a headset, and it turns out it was still doing the feedback, so I have not pinned down what is actually causing that. I'm sorry. Question. Are private space companies worried about contamination? That is a super good question. I honestly don't know the answer. It is my understanding that private space companies have not signed the agreement that the international space agencies have about planetary protection. However, as of right now, there are no private space companies that are leaving the Earth-Moon system, at least that I know of. So it's not yet an issue. When it becomes an issue, I don't know what the response is going to be from the science community, but it's definitely something that's going to have to be looked at. Okay, let me get my notes back. Thank you for the question. Okay, let's move on. So we've talked about why planetary protection and what the categorizations are and all, but how do we do it? How does NASA and other space agencies implement these concepts? So there are multiple ways that NASA works to prevent contamination of other solar system bodies. The most used, the most common ones are documentation, building things in a clean room, sterilization, testing to make sure, and preventing contact. Really, what it all comes down to is the hardware clean, or at least clean enough for whatever category the mission is assigned to? Documentation. Oh, right. Everybody who has to deal with it knows. Anyways, documentation is very, very important for planetary protection so that everybody knows what's going to go on with the mission, everybody's on the same page, and there's an agreement and an understanding of what's going to happen and what's expected to happen. There's lots of documentation in planetary protection, unless you're a Category 1. That really doesn't require anything because scientists just aren't concerned. For Category 2 and Category 2 Star, the missions do require documentation, but that's it. However, the documentation has to have at least a detailed, planned approach of how they're going to comply with planetary protection, and avoidance of impact strategies that they're planning to use. Once the mission has begun and is in progress, then they need to document the actual trajectory, which means the path that the mission has taken. And once the mission is complete, then they also need to document specifically and exactly what happened to the spacecraft or rover or whatever it was, what happened to the mission, where is its final resting place, or how was it destroyed, basically how was it handled to ensure compliance, to ensure that the planetary protection is being maintained. So there's an example here on the slide of a report for the Mars Curiosity rover. That was their documentation that was turned into NASA. And it was a booklet, but okay. Sorry, should not have touched my face in this time, we know, but moving on. So, Categories 3 and Categories 4 require more than just documentation. They have to be what's called biologically clean. We'll get to that term in a moment. But one way to start with that is to simply build in a clean room. That way, everything starts out clean. So NASA has a lot of facilities, and JPL, which is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, it is a division of NASA, they have 4 lab facilities for building missions and doing research on planetary protection. There's a picture of one right there, the Space Microbiology Lab. And you can also see here one of the satellites that JPL is being built in a clean room. Now these clean rooms, there are a lot of scientists out there that work in clean rooms that are usually rooms. At NASA, clean rooms are an entire building size. They're huge because satellites, rovers, rockets, all of these things are huge. And so you can see there's at least 5 people in that picture, and there are a few more that got cut out. They are in their protective gear. It's not to protect them, it's to protect the equipment and the thing they're building there, this satellite. And that's a very large clean room. All right, next, sterilization. So, you've built clean. That doesn't mean that something didn't make it in. You can make sure that microbes, bacteria, viruses, small things, even larger things, are not on the equipment by sterilizing the equipment. If it is something that is heat tolerant, so for example, the parachutes, the thermal blankets, the heat shields, these are all very resistant of high heat, over 100 degrees Celsius. And so we can simply, there's a picture here that's actually a test, but burn the microbes off, heat these things up so hot that nothing can survive it. That's one way. There's also a lot of good old-fashioned cleaning with an alcohol solution. So I've shown isopropyl alcohol here, but what strong alcohol solutions, industrial type, can kill all those kind of microbes also. And then once items are sterile, keep them sterile. So NASA has certain things like this glove box in the picture. So the object that's sterile would go in there, and then a human would slide their hands in those 2 white holes. Those are gloves. And that way they can manipulate and work with whatever's on the inside without risking it adding any contamination to it. Testing of surfaces is very, very important in planetary protection. This is how it is proved whether or not the equipment is meeting the standards. And this is where the term biologically clean comes into play. So we need to make sure there are no contaminants from Earth, or at least a very minimal amount. I mean, it may be impossible to make none, but there's a certain number of what's called spores that are allowed to be on any part of an equipment. And so testing also has very specific requirements. What tools can be used to test, how the tools get used, how often they can be used, how much of a space on a craft one tool can test. So for example, in this picture, the person is using a Q-tip type tool here to wipe a sample off of the satellite, and how far that person's allowed to wipe is governed by the rules also. And then that gets tested to see how many microbes, how many spores are actually on there. There's also rules about how much of the spacecraft needs to be tested. You don't have to test every single surface, but there's a certain percentage of it, and what locations on a spacecraft need to be tested. Things that are outward facing are of more concern than things that are way inside, like inside a rover. The computer control box is very in the center, and it's also, for planetary protection reasons, sealed. And then there are really high efficiency filters on that to make sure that anything that might be inside the box, any bacteria or spores already, cannot get out. So yes, testing, and if testing gets failed, then you have to go back to sterilization and try again. Even when shipping these things, when they're done, probes, rovers, landers, satellites, anything that is on a planetary protection mission needs to stay clean through delivery and launch. And so spacecraft are shipped directly from the clean rooms in sterile containers. You can see here, that's the Mars 2020 rover packaged up, and they're starting to get it, pushing it out of the clean room. So that would have been the first time in a long time that those doors to the outside got opened. Okay. Another very common planetary protection practice is to simply prevent contact with the other bodies in the solar system, right? If the stuff we send into space doesn't come into contact with other worlds, then we don't have a problem. One example is the flight plan for the rocket that was carrying the Mars Phoenix lander. So there's a little picture here, but basically the third stage of the rocket and the lander were attached on the way to Mars, and the third stage is what was doing the propulsion, the pushing of the lander. And the course they were put on, the trajectory, was a flyby of Mars, so they're going to miss, is what that means. As they got close, the third stage and the lander separated from each other, and then the lander adjusted course to head to Mars to do its mission, and the third stage just kept going on that flyby. So, don't have to worry about it anymore for Mars Category 3 or Category 4 restrictions. Now, there are some other cases, more rare, but it definitely happens, where planetary protection decisions get made after the mission has started. Cassini is a great example of this. So, the Cassini-Huygens, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, mission to Saturn and its rings and its moons discovered that Enceladus needed to be reclassified to a Category 3 after it actually had already arrived at Saturn. So, because of its elevated importance, it needed higher planetary protection than was originally planned for. NASA changed their plans for Cassini's end of life. Actually, I'm not certain of what the plan originally was, but NASA considered multiple options for how to end Cassini's life at the end of its mission, at the end of its extended mission, I should say. But the point was they wanted to protect both Enceladus and Saturn's moon Titan from possible contamination by Cassini. If it was simply left in orbit, there was the potential that at some point it might accidentally collide with one of the moons or be sent somehow and unintentionally contaminate Enceladus or Titan. And so the decision was made to destroy it by having it dive into Saturn, and then the pressure from Saturn's atmosphere eventually just crushed the Cassini probe and destroyed it, thus protecting the moons. Okay. So we are back to questions again. Let me check and see. Is contamination an issue on the moon? What a great question. I actually like this one. I will be answering that shortly. Right now the answer is no, but I'll explain it a little more in a minute. Okay, any other questions? Thank you all for interacting with me. I really appreciate it. Let's move on. So, what about Earth? We need to protect ourselves too. How do we do that? There is what's called Category 5. Category 5 is only for missions that are returning samples back to Earth. And there are two subcategories, restricted and unrestricted. Category 5, restricted. This is for returning samples to Earth from places that scientists are worried about contamination harming Earth's biosphere or any kind of life on Earth, and it's called backward contamination. Right now, there are 3 worlds in this category. Do they look familiar? Right. So they are Mars, our neighbor planet, Europa, moon of Jupiter, Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, which are all, of course, the same worlds as are in Category 4 for landers, rovers, and probes, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If there's worry about us, Earth, contaminating those worlds, then it's easy to understand that there should be worry about those worlds potentially contaminating us. This is called restricted Earth return. Category 5, unrestricted. This is for sample return from solar system bodies that have no indication of native life. We don't believe there is life there that would, therefore, there's nothing there to cause us harm back here on Earth. Surprisingly, there are only 4 worlds in this category right now. Venus, our other neighbor planet, our moon, so there's part of the answer to your question. Most comets, and some asteroids. While Category 4 maps very nicely to Category 5 restricted, as we just saw, Category 5 unrestricted is only assigned after review of a mission that is planning to bring materials back. So as space agencies make plans to return samples from other worlds, the list for for either Category 5 restricted or Category 5 unrestricted is going to grow. Now, to talk about the moon specifically, fun fact, originally the moon was classified as Category 5 restricted. So when the Apollo missions went to the moon and were bringing back samples, they had to take extra serious, tight precautions. They put the samples in sample containers. They put those sample containers in very thick, well-lined, heavy, what looked like suitcases that were then sealed up. And when they came back to Earth, the lunar samples were only unsealed in very sterile and well isolated labs. However, after studying all these materials and rocks and dust that was brought back from the moon by the Apollo missions, scientists concluded that the potential for life on the moon was negligible. And so forward and backward contamination, meaning Earth contaminating the moon and the moon contaminating Earth, it is no longer a concern. So, moon effectively should be a Category 1. It's actually listed as a Category 2, which is fine, but In most of the literature and articles I was doing to research this, Earth and Moon are now referred to together as a system. So it's becoming, it hasn't been formalized, but it's becoming apparent that the Moon is thought of as a part of Earth when considering planetary protection. So we're actually talking about not worrying about exchange between the Moon and Earth, but yes, worrying about contaminating the Moon from other sources the same way we can worry about contaminating the Earth from other sources. I hope that answers your question from earlier. And that is my presentation. So I'm going to check for final questions, and while I am answering these, you can ask more, and we will just keep going till I get to the end of the questions. And I'm supposed to also, of course, show, hang on one moment, I don't know why it's glitching out now, there we go, references for this, but we're doing questions now. Okay. Next question. When India sent tardigrades to the Moon, that was okay due to the Moon category? You know what? You've asked something I didn't even know about. I know that India has been operating a whole lot more, especially with the Moon in space. I did not understand that they had actually sent tardigrades. That's very interesting. I would have to guess that yes, it's okay, based on the research I've done. Next question. Does the presence of water ice on the Moon change anything in my opinion? That's a really good question, because water, as noted before, is very important in the search for life, and so that usually elevates things and concerns. I mean, between NASA and all the other space agencies that we've shared information with and have shared information back with us, there's just been no evidence of any kind of anything close to life on the Moon. I know there was the amino acids that were found, and there was speculation for many, many years about the source of those. Did they come from Earth and contamination? Did they build in the labs because there were building blocks of amino acids coming from multiple sources? But even that's not life, and so the scientific consensus is just there isn't life on the Moon, and so we're not concerned about contaminating it, and we're not concerned about it contaminating us. I don't think that the presence of water ice changes that. Oh, you heard that the tardigrades were on the lander that crashed. Oh. Well, I don't know. So there's either they were destroyed in the crash. I don't know. I could speculate a lot of things, or they weren't, obviously. Those are pretty much the two options. I would have to look into it. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. So, that is my presentation. You're welcome. And let's see. Oh, yeah, a little over half an hour. That's about all my allotment. I have a few more minutes here. If anybody wants to pop anything up, I'll stay on for another probably 60 seconds or so. And if another question comes up, I will answer that before signing off. Everybody, thank you for watching. Those of you who will end up watching this later, thank you also. Again, my name is Jennifer German. I'm a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, and I am actually very happy to have done this, my first stream. I'm glad you learned a lot. Thanks for being here. There's a clock over here with a second hand I just noticed. There we go. All right, everybody. Thanks again. Jennifer German, signing off.